Welcome to the RSAA and to the second of our consecutive webinars on Syria. 2 weeks ago, we looked at efforts being made to preserve cultural heritage through the disruption of war and displacement. Today, we focus on politics and particularly the prospects for democratic change in Syria through a discussion between our two panelists. I'm pleased to welcome Qutaiba Idlbi, representative in the United States of the Syrian Opposition Coalition, and Reza Afshar, Executive Director of Independent Diplomat. Syria has dropped out of the headlines in recent months, driven out by COVID and more recently Afghanistan. But the situation in Syria remains desperate for many and fragile at best. For those who are not familiar with Independent Diplomat, it is an organization that provides advice to democratic movements and occasionally governments that find it difficult otherwise to get their voices heard. The former Australian Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, aptly described this as going where conventional diplomacy cannot or will not. And it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome Reza Afshar, with whom I had the pleasure of working in Kabul 15 years ago. There will be an opportunity for questions, so if there are things that you would like to ask either of our panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we will do our best to answer you. But for now, I will hand over to Reza to take the event further. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks so much for having us on. It is a great pleasure to see you again after 15 years. I remember our time in Afghanistan very fondly, and it's a shame that we're sitting here at a moment where all the work that was done in Afghanistan has been unfortunately undone, and I think it's going to be a very troubling time for the future of that country. But I'm very happy to have Qutaiba with us. Just for a bit of background, my last job in the UK government was running the Foreign Office's Syria team in 2013, during which the sarin attack happened in August 2013. And after we failed to intervene, that is when I decided to leave the Foreign Office, as I believed it was a huge mistake not to intervene to protect civilians in Syria. And I went on to Independent Diplomat, and one of our clients was the Syrian opposition at that time. We actually no longer advise the Syrian opposition, but I stay in close touch, of course, with our colleagues and friends there. We stopped in 2018. And Qutaiba has a rich history in Syria, moving through different fields, really, and ending up where he is now, representing the Syrian opposition in the United States. But that's not where he started. And so I'm going to hand over to Qutaiba just to introduce himself and to let us know his journey from a young man in Syria to where he is now, and the steps he took to get there, just for the context.
Sure thing. Thank you, Reza. Many thanks for the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Thanks to you, Michael. And I'll try, of course, to keep it short. You know, taking the journey from Syria here is it's a book length while. I basically grew up in Syria, early 90s. To give, I think, enough background how I got here, my father actually was a nonviolence theologist in Damascus at the time. He was detained 8 times between 1964 and 1980, just in different demonstrations, organizing people, protesting against the regime. So in a way, the atmosphere around us, in the house, the books that filled the walls of our apartment in Damascus, near the presidential palace, it was all kind of like an influential factor and kind of like shaping my thoughts, what's happening around us. I would sneak every night at, and my dad would have those underground meetings every other night with different groups in Damascus. So I would sneak, either listen through the door. And then I think once I was 8 years old, my dad found me, sitting on the other side of the door. So he was like, you don't have to sit here. So he invited me in, and I'm just literally, a child among, people in their 60s and 70s discussing what was happening in Syria at the time. So this was kind of the environment that, I grew up in. But I think one of the main drive kind of that, gave me the push is when my father passed away in 2015, people after the funeral, people in the service stood up and said, those kids deserve to know who their father is. And for me, I was quite sure who my father was, but it turned out I didn't really know exactly, who he was, what he was doing. So one by one, people stood up and started saying, hey, I met Yusuf at this protest at this place. We were detained together. He went to this place. We know how he was tortured this time. So in 3 days, we kind of got, me and my brothers, we got a crash course of my dad's kind of like history of activism in Syria and in other places in the region before we were born. And something that kind of like opened my eyes more to kind of the state we were living in, state of society and country, that even my own father was afraid to tell his children who he was, what he was doing really, what his history was, because he was worried that we would say the wrong thing in front of the wrong people. And this is someone who was more open about, than the average Syrian about what he was doing, about his opinions. Of course, in a way, growing up in Syria, you can notice that you have two shapes of government. You have kind of the frontal government, the one that is doing the regular bureaucratic operation, including ministers, prime minister, all of those people who are just, you realize in a way, they're not any different from who you are as an average Syrian. Even if you are, no matter how high you are in kind of like the civil government. And then in the background, you have the Assad regime families, the cronies or businessmen around them, and specific leaders of the military who kind of close the circle around Assad. Those are the real state. So if someone is in trouble, and I remember hearing around family, like they would say like, oh, let's talk to so-and-so, our cousin who's a minister. And someone else would say like, he's just a minister. He cannot do anything. He cannot even get himself. And people, use it as a joke, but they were serious about it. They would say like, he cannot get himself to the restroom if he cannot, ask his superiors permission. So in a way, there were kind of like those two circles where majority of Syrians basically they only have access to this front layer of government. And then you have the Assad cronies in the back with access to everything, who are really controlling everything in the country. Of course, that adds to the, atmosphere of lack of freedoms, there was a famous saying in Syria that walls has ears. And in a sense, I think, my dad's experience kind of like taught me exactly that, again, even like this very open about his work, very upcoming, opposition of the regime, was not even able to tell his family about his own history. I was once in 8th grade, and I remember I had to write an essay about the 1967 war. Being young doesn't want to ask for help as always. I went to my dad's, library, picked a couple of books I saw about the 1967 war, wrote my essay. And then the second day, I was asked to leave class. In Syria, if you do something bad, you're not allowed to attend class, and you have to stand outside for the whole day. It was the first time in my life that something like that happened. And then they asked my parents to come to school. And it turns out they basically told, my father, keep your son in line, or, your family is going to lose him and is going to lose you. And I remember from that time, my father told me, you are always free to say what you believe in, but always remember that it would affect those who are close to you. And I didn't really understand what it meant until, of course, the uprising started in 2011. I was detained twice, and then the third time, when the government couldn't arrest me, they tried to arrest my 16-year-old brother. And a connection close to the family told us, he said, you know, Qutaiba, you've seen torture, you've seen solitary confinement, you've seen all of these. None of that is going to be an exception for your little brother just because he's a minor. If you guys go in, you're going in forever this time. So eventually, basically, that was when I had to make the decision that, you know, it was enough for me for, you know, in Syria. I couldn't stay there anymore. We made the trip eventually to Lebanon, then to Egypt. I was in the region for almost a year and a half, attending opposition meetings, trying to get a sense of what was happening more on the official exiled opposition side. And I think it was really, from that day, I think it was really kind of like surprising, kind of like the different dynamics that were happening between, you know, what was happening on the ground and what's happening outside in terms of like politics, in terms of, you know, organizing between opposition, of course, different foreign affairs ministries, you know, from UK, the United States, France, and other regional countries. I eventually, Ambassador Ford, who was the US Syria envoy, he invited me to come to the United States. I did a fellowship with the State Department called the Leaders for Democracy Fellowship. And it started kind of like, my professional life in a sense was mostly all in Washington, DC. Although my background in Syria was in financial management, I went back to school in the US. I got a political science degree from Columbia University in New York. I did, for most of my time here, I did atmospheric reporting and third-party monitoring and evaluation for projects for United States, US aid, and for US State Department. Along with my, of course, my work mostly or advocacy on Syria, that focused on justice and accountability, in the sense helping, at the time and until today, families of American hostages being held in Syria by the Assad regime. Today, I'm the representative of the National Coalition for Syrian Opposition and Revolutionary Forces to the United States. That is the official body representing 44 groups of the Syrian opposition. It was established in 2013 as a platform to bring all of the Syrian opposition together to negotiate with the regime, not with the goal of taking power from the Assad regime. Actually, the coalition internal mandate says that it will actually be dissolved the moment there is a political transition in Syria and with the establishment of a transitional governing body in Syria. So it's not a body that is, you know, looking to actually get power, but actually it's a platform to facilitate, you know, the negotiations and the transition with the Assad regime. For me, you know, this is the, you know, the only institution, in a way, official institution that the democratic uprising of 2011 has. It got recognized by the United Nations, by over 100 countries, as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. So in my capacity, I try as much as possible to, you know, represent, the hopes, dreams, and pains of Syrians, what they wish to achieve now and, you know, in 100 years, whenever we're able to build our country back.
Thanks, Qutaiba. And you have an extraordinary story, and we could spend literally 2 hours talking about it. I've had the privilege to get to know you quite a bit over the years, and it is quite an extraordinary story of both sacrifice and commitment. And I think it's important for people to be reminded of the kind of human aspect with respect to Syria. It's very easy to talk in broad terms, and often it's very sad for me to hear the way the discourse is, particularly in the United States, where people talk about, you know, it's an unsolvable conflict, you know, people just need to fight it out, you know, there's no point trying to engage in it, etc., etc. Whereas I think, you know, we need to be reminded that there are, you know, at least over 500,000 people who've been killed in this conflict, mainly as a consequence of its own government's actions, and that each individual in Syria suffers. And I, again, have the privilege of knowing many Syrians, and I don't think I know a single one who isn't deeply affected by this conflict, whether it's death in the family, missing family members, torture themselves, detention, etc., etc. I mean, it literally is a conflict that touches every single Syrian. And I think, I think it'd be useful, Qutaiba, just to outline, what the aims of the revolution are now. I think people saw 2011, and some of it was quite clear. Some of it was quite clear what the movement was trying to achieve. But I think we've got to the stage now again where people have switched off, and I think people don't necessarily even know that the revolution is continuing. So if you could just paint a picture of what's happening right now inside Syria with respect to the kind of revolutionary movement.
Sure thing. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, Reza, in a way, the way things started, I was in the first demonstration in Damascus in March 28th, 2011. And I remember in a moment, thousands of people just standing up. And the only thing that everyone can chant for is freedom, freedom, hurriya, hurriya. That is the only word that people for, like probably 10, 15 minutes, it's the only thing that people can come out with. Because in a way, it was kind of a liberating moment. It was a moment of, rebirth. I mean, at least for myself, when you realize what you are as a human beings, what it really means, to say freedom and really, live it in a way, being able to talk your mind without, fear, without looking behind your back when you have authorities in front of you, but still able to do it. The transition that happened, of course, we didn't transition. And I think, of course, people look at the conflict as kind of like in a sense of war. But in a way, the conflict in Syria wasn't a war in the common sense that we are used to. In a way, it wasn't really a war between two sides who are trying to, take control of territory. There was no one side from the, revolution side, in a sense, especially when it comes to talking about local communities taking the fight. It was actually each city or each town, each province trying to take the fight to actually protect themselves. In 2012, after we reached the peak of the demonstrations, what people do, and Daraya in the suburbs of Damascus was a great example for that. Activists actually, when the regime was willing to come in militarily to the town because the protests took the whole town, the intelligence and the police were afraid to engage in violence with the protesters because of the large numbers. So the regime decided to deploy military. And what the activists decided at the time is that we don't want a conflict with the military itself. We don't want to turn this into a war. So they actually withdrew from the whole town. They went to the suburbs, to the farms around Daraya. And what the regime did when they entered, in one day, they killed 625 people, women, children, and whoever men they can find. And they went on, they filmed it on the Syrian official TV. They were like, oh, look at those. And, there was this famous scene of one of the Syrian government reporters interviewing like this woman who was dying on the side of the street and asking her like, hey, how are your terrorist relatives? How are, those gangs that, like, tell us what are the crimes that you have been doing? So this scene kind of, and there were like tens of scenes like these around the country. This is kind of what shaped, the stage after. So after that, a lot of those local communities felt that they need to stay to defend their own homes, their own families. So in a sense, the conflict was all of those families collectively, fighting, each one doing, on their own front to protect their own town. And that's when the regime, of course, couldn't, there were many factors, of course. There was support from the outside. There were groups who were trying to take kind of like claim on that fight. But in reality, on the ground, it was just every town and city fighting for its own survival and for the survival of its own people. That, of course, I mean, fronts changed. A lot of, whole towns and villages were displaced. Daraya, the example that I mentioned, we have, Daraya local council is now acting in exile, and 70% of Daraya people are actually either between northern Syria and between refugee communities. Very few, decided to stay there. They still have not been able to even go back to their homes, even though the government has taken control of the town, for the last 5 years. So in a way, this kind of the war fronts, so-called, have shifted. There hasn't been really, an active war front. At least, what is left for people who stood out in 2011 is kind of like those small areas in northeast and northwest Syria. We have, in a way, I mean, the United States is kind of providing some protection to those areas in northeast, and Turkey is providing some protection to those areas in northwest. Because when we were talking about those areas, for example, in northwest, it was originally a home for less than 1 million people. Today, we have almost 5 million people in those areas. And it's those families, those people who went out in 2011, and they have no home for themselves and their families now. So in a way, for a lot of Syrians today, what they want to defend is kind of what they define, what we defined freedom in 2011 is having the ability to really rebuild our country, engage with the regime faithfully. I think people understood that there is, those two structures of a state. You have the face of the government who have really no control. You need to keep them in place because those are the ones running the country. But we want to make sure that this kind of like back line controlling everything from behind, those are the people who either need to yield to the demands of the people or they need to leave. Today, things are very different because we're not talking about, to be honest, a whole Syria approach anymore. The regime for the last 10 years, even with all the pressures, proved that it's not willing to give any small concession, not to the international community, but for the Syrian people themselves. Not very long ago, groups of families of victims and arbitrary detainees in Syria, they got together and they signed a charter asking the regime, not asking for accountability or justice, just asking the regime to release the fate of those who were detained since 2011. So basically, in a way, the regime was getting a green card just to say like, hey, you know what? I have those people are dead. And their families were saying, we're not gonna go after you. Just tell us if our kids, if our mothers, if our sisters, if our parents are dead or alive. So we know that shall we wait for them or shall we just mourn them and move on with our lives? And the regime still did not respond to this golden opportunity to kind of like get away with the killing of detention of over 100,000 people. The regime in the last 5 years, the regime supported by Russia did a lot of those national reconciliation deals where, it told local, communities, if you put down weapons, we will forget about what happened in the past. We will release your detainees. We're not going to allow the intelligence agencies to come in. It would only be the police and the government institutions. And a lot of those communities accepted, with guarantees, of course, provided by the Russian military in Syria. Not so long ago, again, I mean, the regime, a year or two would pass, they would turn back on those communities. Daraa was a great example for that. Detention is immediately back. Oppression is immediately back. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch issued a report not so long ago also detailing the killing of at least 66 refugees who tried to return to Syria in the last year or so. So even for refugees who are willing to come back to forgive me here, to the cage of the Assad family in Syria, they still were not able to escape the persecution of Assad. So today we are in a moment where a lot of Syrians feel, one, the international community failed them, to hold the Assad regime responsible, including, of course, Russia and China, because Russia was one of the countries who provided promises to the Syrian people of change. Russia is the country who actually, signed on the UN Security Resolution 2254, asking for political transition in Syria. And again, I know a lot of people talk about, regime change in the Iraq sense. No one was talking about that in Syria, by the way. 2254 is a partnership. I know not a lot of politicians would like to say that, but it is in text a partnership with the Syrian regime, with the Ba'ath Party, to actually form a transitional governing body in Syria. So no one is talking about putting the regime out. And I think Syrians themselves, looking at what happened in Iraq, they were the closest to look at what happened in Iraq. Not anyone else in any other capital or city saw what happened in Iraq more than we saw it in Syria, and more than the Iraqis themselves, of course. No one wants that model, of course, to be implemented. But since the international community is not able to kind of implement that model today, Syrians, they just want to, at the moment, live with what they have. If there is a little bit of freedom and stability they can set for themselves in those areas in northern Syria, then this is what they need, they want to do. It's a time where, and I think even there's a challenge for us here in the official opposition institutions. The coalition, for example, was established at a time when we were talking about just a coordination body, kind of like taking the opposition from a conflict time to negotiating a political settlement. There were no kind of governing responsibilities. Today, we have areas that are liberated from the Assad regime. That require a lot also, because Syrians are asking us today, since the Assad regime is not willing to move with a political transition, we want you to be leading governance, providing a future for us and for our children. So this is, in a way, this is the challenge we find ourselves today of, establishing, at least a safe haven for Syrians in those areas. Not in the sense of the freezing the conflict only, but a safe haven where they can actually feel stable, where they don't feel that, we live in a tent that we need to leave tomorrow or the day after. They need a place where they feel, their kids can go to school. And if they go to school, there's a future for them there. There's a meaning for the things that they do in this land. They can build and get back. And I think by focusing on that model, by, focusing on at least fulfilling those needs, those short and medium term needs for Syria, maybe this is the best recipe to bring Syria back together. Today, we're talking about 4 different Syrias, de facto Syrias on the ground in Syria, with different authorities controlling them. Unfortunately, there's nothing that is unifying them. On the table, I think politically, we're trying to convince different parties to create at least a sense of, common base that would make Syrians at least feel that they are connected to each other in the different areas of control. So one of those examples is establishing or re-establishing the state civil registry in all areas of Syria. So at least when Syrians are walking around, they have the same ID, their kids, they have the same birth certificates, so they don't feel like there are those differences. And the hope is by actually building that model, by showing what a post-Assad model would look like, we give some time to different players, but mainly Russia and Iran, who have the most leverage on the Assad regime, to actually come back to the table, and then we can negotiate back what Syria would look like. But I think we need, with everything happening at the moment, with the lack of investment from the international community, even to be honest, in holding talks about what's happening in Syria, I think the hope is with what the Syrian people, with the will that the Syrian people have. Today, you go, to some areas in northern Syria, the economy is flourishing. People are building, despite having kind of like that sense of what's going to happen tomorrow. But Syrians, are tired of the days where, they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, where they don't have a sense of is the international community is going to support us to build a future or not. They're willing to at least put some pillars on the ground themselves, and put some base out there. And then, they hope that others will come and join them in this battle to build a future for a lot of Syrians. I hope it would be a better democratic and a free future for all.
I mean, Qutaiba, thank you. There was one thing you said in there about, which I think is worth just talking a bit more about, where you talked about this request from families of the missing to find out what has happened to their loved ones. And I think it's worth, and correct me if I'm wrong, Qutaiba, but just for the sake of people listening, some people might think, well, of course they didn't admit it. They didn't want to say what had happened because the regime doesn't want to admit that it's committed these crimes. But from all the evidence, it doesn't seem to be that that's the motivation. I think the motivation for the regime is to keep people guessing and questioning and in fear, because they don't care about admitting their crimes. We have documentation that the regime has created itself that implicates itself in all of the crimes that have been committed, almost at an individual level, like every single human being that has been detained and tortured. They have documentation for that. And as those who are pursuing prosecutions say, there's more material implicating the Syrian regime than there was against the Nazi regime back in the Second World War. The degree to which they're willing to actually implicate themselves is pretty extraordinary, and that's why we have cases in Europe and elsewhere that are being pursued, and we've had some successful prosecutions precisely because they're willing to document their crimes in the way that they do. So I think it's just worth saying they're not refusing to tell people where their loved ones are because they're fearful of prosecution. They're refusing to do it because it's a tactic of oppression, a tactic of war. And I think this regime has shown itself to be incredibly ruthless in the tools that it uses, and in part because there are no consequences. There are basically no consequences, and it believes that there are no consequences for what it's doing. The picture you painted is a pretty bleak one in some ways, Qutaiba. Obviously, it's one in which the sort of aims of the revolution have shifted, and where we get to a point now where you're talking about, kind of local level evolution of democracy and using that as a model for everywhere else. I mean, what do you say a bit more, I think, about what you think the plausible route to a democratic future is, and what, if anything, is the international role in that?
Absolutely. Of course, first I want to emphasize exactly what you said about accountability for the detainees. And even, in a practical sense, there was an official proposal sent by the UN Syria envoy to the Syrian government that includes actually the legal language and the way to how, even the regime can actually provide that information while still protecting itself, from accountability or from prosecution. Again, as you said, for the regime, torture, detention, and disappearance is just a tool of governance. It's not just, a punishment for like a random act of violence. It's actually built within the state. I myself was detained twice, and I think one thing that shocked me about detention, that regardless of all the readings I've done on detention, especially in Syria, is how systematic it was. There was a physician to examine people to see which level of torture the regime needs to start with, so they would not waste their time with things that a detainee can handle. There was a sophisticated detail, for the lack of other expression, on how to actually, inflict pain on detainees. I'm sorry for the graphic picture, but one of those examples is pulling nails out. The regime does not just use, for example, regular pillars to pull a nail out. And the expression is actually, in a way, wrong in that sense, because what the regime do is that they push the nails out because they want to make sure, so they have this special pillar with kind of like it's a metal toothbrush, where they put on the finger and they basically push on the flesh around the finger to push the nail out. This is, of course, much more painful than just like a one rip off. And for that, I mean, again, whoever thought about the detail and, putting the effort to design the tools to set out, and we're not talking about the flying carpet, we're not talking about the German chair, the French chair, all of these tools kind of give you an idea of how much thought and order. And as you said, the documentation itself, people think that sometimes that the regime does not have this information. Actually, the regime has more information and more organized today about detention than it was even 10 years ago. The Iranian government actually helped the regime install kind of like an automation system for detention, especially in intelligence agencies. And now the head of the National Security Office, from his office, can know basically each agency, and under each agency, each branch, how many detainees they have, who are those detainees, why are they being held. So there is, yes, and of course the National Security Office, this is run by the president. So as Assad himself knows, in a room in his palace at the National Security Office, he can access the system and sees how many people are there and where people are. So there is, even in the sense that, Russians sometimes claim hey, this is a war, we don't know where people are. That's actually false, because as you said, we saw it in the Caesar files. We saw it in the documents, more than 1 million documents that were, obtained from different government, agencies, that the regime actually do know, and they have access to where those people are. So this is on that regard. On the sense on how we move forward, the Syrian people didn't lose hope. Let me just put this straightforward. They still have the same will, they still have the same passion. The fact that people decided to leave the homes they grew up in, and in a sense, I mean, people talk about kind of refugee or displacement as in you just leave your home. But for those who didn't experience it, you're losing all of your social safety net. In the back of everyone's mind, if you're staying at your home, if something happens to you, at least 10, 20 people around you, you have family, probably a couple hours drive or a flight away from you, that, if you're going to lose your home or you're going to get broke, I mean, everyone with a family, they probably have this backup plan, okay, if something happens to me, my family can seek refuge with this friend or with this family member or so on. Syrians lost that. And that is the most important thing that they've lost, is that they don't have that safety net. They don't have a backup option to kind of depend on. So when they make the decision to actually leave all of that and go to northwest or to northeast, because for them it is free of Assad, because they can, even with all the problems, they can be themselves, they can get a sense of freedom, that is a huge thing for them. And Syrians are still willing to continue that sacrifice. Yes, economically it's not good, infrastructure is not there, there's a lot of problems, but for Syrians, this is the place where we can act. The most important thing is there, which is our ability to be ourselves, our ability to be human beings, our ability to be Syrians. From that, so again, where we are now, international community is tired of what's happening in Syria. There is no enough pressure being exerted on Russia, Assad, or Iran for different reasons. Some countries, they're eager to get Iran back into the JCPOA, that they don't want, to kind of raise the heat in other countries because it might complicate things with Iran in the nuclear negotiations. And of course, my father negotiated with the Iranian government for years about their theological overreach in the region in the 90s and early 2000s. And I can tell you from at least my father's experience, this is exactly the wrong approach with the type of Iranian government we have in place today. Because, as in Arabic, we say, if you give them kind of like access to the living room, you will find them in the bedroom like the next day. So it's not the type of language that the Iranian government really understands. But this is where we are now. So as long as this is happening, Russia and Iran doesn't really feel an incentive to actually give any concession in Syria. And so, and as well as the Assad regime itself. The Assad regime, feels, especially Assad. I know Assad, I met him before the uprising. I know the way he thinks. Today, he thinks he won despite the will of 24 million Syrians. He see like he can, meet foreign officials. People are talking about, lifting the sanctions from Syria. So he feel empowered. He doesn't feel the pressure to actually give anything back. In that atmosphere now, this is not of course, a quest to say like, okay, things are done, let's move on. Because again, and I'm going to repeat it again and again and again, for Syrians, it's not done yet. For Syrians, there is no such a thing as there is no hope. Because the fact is, if you look at where we were in 2011 and where we are today, Syrians feel that they have actually won something. We lost a lot since 2011. We lost friends, we lost relatives, we lost homes, we lost heritage. But for millions of people, we have won our freedom. And without this ability, without this one thing, without freedom, we are not who we are. We are not humans and we are not Syrians. So if you look at a trajectory between 2011 and 2021, we have at least won our freedom. And this is a great thing. The question is, how do we get our country back? The only thing that might actually put Assad back with Iran and Russia on the negotiations table, if they feel that, if they feel the leverage that we have, if they feel that they cannot move forward without actually coming back to the table and going through a political transition in Syria. How do we get there? So the fact that you have most of northern Syria free of Assad, of the Assad regime, is a leverage that we can, exert on the Assad regime. Putting an investment in those areas, making sure this could be kind of like a model for a future Syria. Call it a West vs East Germany. Call it, whatever name you want to put on it. But this is the area where we can put, our investment, our resources, our efforts mainly, to make sure that at least those Syrians who kind of like cut their ties back within Assad Syria, they want, a free society and free country, we can invest with those people and build something for them. And eventually, knowing Assad always plays on the long game. And I'm very, very kind of, young and maybe in a very early level in politics. And you can call me naive, but for one time, I, still hope the international community could look just 10 years from today instead of like just looking at the next year. Because, regimes like Iran, governments in Russia and else, this is where they're looking. They don't looking at what's happening only next year. They're looking, we are staying in power forever. Your governments are staying in power for 4 years. We're gonna win, by time we are winning. So it requires from us, even serving our own constituents, that we look beyond the 4 years that we are in power for the benefits of, not only for the benefits of Syrians, but for the benefits of our own constituents across Europe and the United States. How do we do that? Again, and sorry for the long answer. We do that by leveraging northern Syria on the medium term and basically win time with Assad. So we put our investment, we put our resources there. And eventually we show Assad that if he's not willing to move forward for the Syrian people, we're gonna move forward with those who chose to escape his tyranny, to escape his oppression. And eventually Russia and Iran, they want the prize. They can't really continue to rule Syria the way it is now. They want reconstruction money, they want a recognition of Assad. If those two things are not on the table, and if northern Syria is getting that without Assad himself, they're gonna push Assad to come to the table to negotiate a way forward. And again, we're not, as idealist probably as I was in 2011, I think a lot of Syrians realize that change takes time, that things cannot change overnight. And they understand that there are some sacrifices that they need to put on the short term. So maybe, change could happen, if not by the end of their time, for, the generations that comes after us. So again, it's not it's not something happening overnight. If we can do that over the next 5 to 10 years, be able to kind of change the leverage on the ground and get Russia and Iran and the Assad regime on the table by that, I think this is the only viable option with everything we have on the table. However, it requires one important thing. It doesn't require a huge investment. I think on a humanitarian level, we're putting a lot on emergency response. We're putting a lot on food baskets, and we're putting a lot on the type of emergency aid because of the problems that Assad is creating. I think what the last 10 years proved is that when there is a political will by itself, Assad is willing to give concession. We draw a red line in 2013. Assad came running with chemical weapons, with everything he can, he would provide. There was some pressure in 2014, 2015, Assad starting even releasing the fate of detainees in a way that kind of also protected the regime, because he said, I'm not going to release names. And then suddenly the civil registry started showing up with names of detainees who are registered as dead. So they didn't give it, but they felt the pressure because they felt there was actually a will in the international community to do something about Assad. And that was enough to push him back to the table, to push him to put concessions. So this is mainly what we are missing. We're not talking about an increased investment, anywhere in Syria or in the region, but showing that we are actually willing to put our money where our mouth is.
Thank you, Qutaiba. And I want to open it up to questions. I just wanted to say one thing on the back of that, which is, the struggle throughout from when I was working on it at the Foreign Office to when I moved to Independent Diplomat and all the work that we did with the opposition, it's always been, how do you get that pressure to get folks to the table? And I think, the biggest, I think, basically lie that has been perpetrated, I think, and it happened through the Obama era, like post 2013, once the military option was sort of off the table, it's just not true to say that you can't use those tools to put enough pressure to get people to the table. And this idea that somehow you can't confront Russia, you can't confront Iran, it's all nonsense. We've seen when you apply the pressure, when the threat is credible, that people do come back to the table. And it's a tool that's been used before at Dayton with respect to Bosnia and so on. And I think the fact that Russia, China, Iran, Syria, they don't believe that the international community has the will to apply the pressure to bring people back to the table. And this is why you see this constant kind of circular motion where we just can't move things forward. And that can change. Governments could decide tomorrow to behave differently and to tackle this differently. There really isn't any obstacle to doing it. And it's part of the reason I left government, was I was so frustrated with the sudden shift in how we use power and how we project power. And that shift has persisted and has got worse throughout this period. But again, with the political will, it can come back. You can reinstate that. But at the moment, nobody's willing to do so. And I think that is a major obstacle to moving things forward. I'd like to open it up to questions. Michael, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed to both of you. It's fascinating. And so, I mean, first of all, to the audience, please do put your questions in using the Q&A button. I had well, a comment and a question. I mean, first of all, Reza, just picking up that point you were making, that with hard power options off the table after 2013, the world seemed to have stopped believing in soft power options. Although on the screen behind you, the UN is a standing monument to the belief that dialogue can achieve things. And I mean, the UN has many problems, and particularly, obviously, the structure of the Security Council means that Russia and China are in a position to block things that they don't like. But vast investment goes in to soft power initiatives of one kind and another, and it doesn't have to be at the UN. There are other channels too. I just wanted to ask Qutaiba, one significant power that you didn't mention is Turkey, and Turkey has started to, I mean, as the US has sort of left a bit of a gap, Erdogan's government has seemed more willing to act directly, and indeed in opposition to the preferences of its NATO allies. I don't know if you could say briefly, please, because there are sort of questions that are coming in, if you could say how you see Turkey's role playing out over the next couple of years.
I think the main challenge for Turkey today, and has been since the broke of the peace negotiations with the PKK in Turkey, the Kurdish issue has been agenda, number one on the Turkish agenda in both Turkey and Syria. Things, of course, and of course, there are different factors that jump in, but number one has been the fear of how the Syrian conflict is affecting the internal dynamics that were happening between the Turkish government and the PKK. We saw for them, for example, the moment the US and the international coalition announced their partnership with the PKK, with the YPG and the PYD in Syria, the Kurdish, the Workers' Kurdistan Party affiliate in Syria, the peace negotiations that were happening in Turkey just broke off, and everyone walked off the table, because there was a sense that I can get through, again, through weapons, what I wouldn't be getting on the negotiations table. I think what is really required is kind of like a re-understanding of how things are today now in Turkey and in Syria. Things has shifted along from where they were in 2015 or even before in 2011. But there is and regardless of the kind of all the problems we see today, there is an opportunity to kind of at least solve some of these issues and problems that they were created. We're not at a stage today where similar to where ISIS was in 2014 or in the years after. ISIS is still there, it's still a danger, but so we still have a space to work with, as the United States or as the international coalition to defeat ISIS. There is an opportunity to exert pressure on our partners on the ground to at least, remove the issue of, the counter-ISIS force from the list of problems between NATO or between, Europe and the United States and Turkey. Because this is, believe me, speaking to Turks a lot, knowing the Turkish government, this is always number one on the agenda. What's happening with the PKK, YPG in northern Syria. And it's something, to be honest, we as Syrians have, some problems with. Eventually, and I tell people politically, in a war you have to, or post-conflict, you have to negotiate with everyone to get to the table. Politically, we know we have to negotiate, for example, with parties in Northeast to get it to a solution. The problem is what we're seeing today, and we're in continuous conversations with the autonomous administration, other people, and they would tell you that, they can give you a certain, they would agree to a certain thing, but a sentence that always comes in the talks is, we don't know if Jamil will approve that or not. We don't know if so-and-so Al-Dar will. And we're talking about hardcore Turkish citizens, leaders in the PKK who are involved in internal Syria politics. So for me, when we talk about kind of like this issue, I'm like, just leave it to the Syrians, whether it is pressure for, on Syrians to not to talk to other Syrians, or whether it is pressure from non-Syrians, for like every party basically is trying to, include Syrians in their own battle. And I tell people, we have enough battles to deal with, as Syrians. We want to build our country. So there is a way out here, especially, and this is something on the United States to do, to actually exert pressure on the counterforce on the ground, to expel Turkish and Iranian leaders within the PKK from Syria, to make sure that actually the leadership at least have a sense of independence. There is a system in the autonomous administration in Syria called the cadres system. It's basically in every civil institution, in every local council, there are advisors position, so-called advisors position, that are directly appointed by the PKK. So you have an elected local council, but the budget, the hiring, the planning is all controlled by two people who are appointed by entity that is based between Turkey and Iraq. And Turkey kind of like sees that. So it sees kind of like a seed for a PKK being established in Syria. So I think Turkey's concerns are legitimate. The way that they are being addressed may not be the best way we wish that they are implemented, but I think the ball is in our court to at least try to move forward with this issue by putting enough pressure to ensure, one, that the Syrian conflict remains Syrian, that basically at least non-Syrian, non-state actors are not so much involved, in the conflict, and then we can move to the state actors. So I think there is an opportunity there where maybe Turkey then could feel less pressure, or would feel more willing to actually address some of the other issues that are on the table. But again, I feel like, the opportunity is there to be able to solve kind of like this main issue that is always the obstacle on the table when we're talking about anything or everything else.
Thank you. I'd like to go to a question from Michael Burton. It's two separate elements, really. He asks, first of all, to what extent does the regime depend on the person of Assad? What would change if he disappeared overnight? And secondly, how secure are the free areas from the regime's further assault?
So on number one, the regime is very dependable on Assad. Without Assad himself, absolutely there is no enough pillars to hold the regime as it is now. So I mean, if Assad is gone overnight, I can tell you the regime feels the need to kind of like fall into this partnership with the opposition or with other groups out there, because they know it cannot hold itself. The internal dynamics within the Assad regime is very dependable, and this is something by structure is very dependable on the person of Assad himself. This was true when Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, was in power, and it's more true for Assad himself. Because Hafiz al-Assad, and I'm sorry about the kind of a little bit academic maybe practice here, is Hafiz built the regime for his benefit and like his close family, but understood he needs to make partnerships with other segments of the community. So he made partnership with the bourgeoisie, businessmen from other groups. He made some partnerships with the big tribes in the south and in northeast Syria to give them some power. He like bits and pieces of power to every other significant group within the country. Assad, the son, didn't really understand that dynamic. And this is probably one of the reasons, one of the factors that led to the uprising. He took power, all of those small pieces of power from all of those segments, and monopolized it with him and his close family. So we even saw a shift in dynamics, even within the revolution, that within the Alawite community that is supportive for Assad, In the early stage of the uprising, we saw there is a shift of support from Alawites who are in the Latakia Mountains to Alawites in Tartus. So a different, basically, so the old Alawites felt, that they don't have a stake in this war, and Assad has to depend on kind of a new segment of the Alawite community that were not participating or, benefiting from the regime. Now, this new segment that Assad depended on, in kind of like winning the military war, they feel as frustrated. And I was talking to some of the leaders in the Alawite community about the recent migration movement through Belarus. And the person I'm talking to, he said, we just buried 3 of our cousins on the borders with Poland last week. Because a lot of those, even Alawites, were supportive to the regime. They don't really feel that they are, the regime is even, fulfilling what, it promises them, because again, it's still focused on Assad and the family. So in short, if Assad is gone, I wish somehow with a goddish power or other power that he's gone overnight. Yeah, things would not be the same absolutely for the Assad regime. And the key is, there is no one figure to be able to hold the regime in place if Assad himself is gone. One comment here I feel like I need to mention. I mentioned early on this, and again, I think it's really important to understand that you have the regime and you have kind of like you have 2 layers of the regime, Assad and his family, and then you have the government. If Assad himself falls down, the government, there is still a government in place. And maybe this is what you need to kind of like give the government of Al-Ba'ath Party some power that it can exert, and then maybe lead a transition with the opposition, a political transition in Syria. And it is an opportunity. Politically speaking, I think if the Ba'ath Party is given that opportunity, it's actually great opportunities to them, because, maybe some of the old ideals of the leftist socialist ideals of the Ba'ath Party is still there within the Syrian society. It is still kind of like acceptable if the Ba'ath Party is a true Ba'ath Party, not the Assad Ba'ath Party. So that is on the Assad. The second question was on, you're on mute, sorry, Michael.
Sorry, so how secure are the areas outside government control?
Yes. So secure in the terms of bombardment from the war, it's not very, of course, Assad and Russia depends on really the area. Areas of northwest under Turkey are not very secure. They're still accessible. Russia and the regime is bombing different areas on a daily basis, not to the same level we have seen before, like in the years before, but it's still happening. But the more in areas of northwest, they are more secure, from bombardment because of the existence of U.S. forces on the ground. But something really important here to mention, even when those areas are secured from Assad and Russia, basically in the skies, they are not secured from Assad and Russia on the ground. So in terms of intelligence, Assad, and Russia has infiltrated all of those areas because of the lack of, a government structure in place that can, organize society, organize police, have a real counterterrorism, an intelligence force on the ground. So Assad on a daily basis can send car bombs inside those areas, can do assassinations in those areas, can get after activists and, politicians and local leaders. So in a way, and that's why, one of the main pillars of investment in northern Syria is an investment in the governing structure, in at least semi-representative governing structure, because we need those real security services, not the security services of Assad, real security services that could actually protect those areas from Assad, not by kind of like implementing, we're not talking about like the ability to have a lot of weapons, but just the ability to actually do real intelligence work on the ground to counter this power of Assad.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful sort of sense you've managed to convey to us, I think, of what what the current situation is in Syria, because as I said at the beginning, Syria has dropped out of people's line of sight lately, and there's clearly a great deal more that could be said. Unfortunately, we are going to have to end there for this week. First of all, just mention for our audience that our next event will be on the 16th of December, when we meet at the Aga Khan Centre in London for the first in a series of events on culture, conflict and recovery. That's a very relevant thing in the Syrian context, of course, bearing in mind what happened while ISIS had control of some parts of the country. But for the first in the series, Rory Stewart will be speaking online from Yale University, along with Matt Reed from the Aga Khan Foundation and Jonathan Ryder from Aleph Strategies. The event will be followed by a reception that is doubling as the RSAA's Christmas drinks. So do please come in person if you can. But if you can't, it will be online as well. You'll just miss out on the free drinks. For now, though, I would like to thank Qutaiba Idlbi and Reza Afshar for a very engaging debate, and our audience for joining us. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Reza.